Good morning all and welcome. My name is Brendan Haskins and I'm excited to welcome you all to this morning's Tech Central webinar on behalf of Altron Systems Integration and TELUS Digital Identity and Security. Thank you for giving us all your time this morning, and we really hope that you're able to get some value out of this morning's discussion. Joining me on the call this morning is Karen Voss and Neil Cossa. Karen Voss is the Senior Manager of Crypto for Altron Systems Integration, and she looks after this area of speciality for Altron. Karen has been in the security space with Altron for the last 12 or so years. And Neil joins us. He's the Regional Director of Africa for TELUS and has been in that role with TELUS for the last 10 years. Altron Systems Integration are one of only 2 distributors of TELUS in Africa and offer their range of CPL and PayShield solutions. And CPL, if anyone is wondering, stands for Cloud Protection and Licensing. I didn't know that, so I had to go and look that up, but I don't think we were expecting everyone to know that off the bat. So the topic of conversation this morning is encryption, shielding financial transactions and personal data from prying eyes. And we invite you all to participate. We've got quite an open format plan for the conversation this morning. And how it's going to work is that only Karen, Neil, and I will have our mics and cameras on. And if necessary, I've got a really long list of questions for the 2 of them to answer. But what we would much prefer is obviously to hear from all of you on the call and to steer the conversation in the direction that you would like. So at any point, if you have a question, please pop it into the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your screens on the Zoom call. And then I'll line them up for Karen or Neil to talk around or to answer. Please don't be afraid of asking any questions on the topic. And if you are afraid that it might sound like a silly question, I'm happy to just say it's from me. I've got a free license here to ask all the silly questions. So please feel free. And I promise there are actually really no silly questions. We're all here to learn and to engage on this topic and to talk with these 2 knowledgeable folk around this. So please fire off anything that you have to ask. So to get the session going, I'm going to ask Karen and Neil to kick us off with a bit of an introduction to themselves and their businesses and the topic. Coming from these 2 people who have spent a long time focusing on assisting businesses and with implementing and managing these sort of technologies. And then after that, we'll move into the questions. Karen, if I can say ladies first, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. Please, could you give us a bit of an overview of the topic from your perspective and Altron's perspective and what you've been seeing in the market around encryption?
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. As I prefer how Brendan introduced me in terms of being in security for 12 years. It's been a little bit longer than that, but that would be showing my age. So as Brendan alluded to, the fact that I am responsible for the crypto division, we are one of the distributors for the TELUS solutions. So our focus is purely on all forms of encryption, whether it's data encryption, transaction encryption, all those things that generally people don't chat about in general conversations. The objective of today, from my perspective in terms of scheduling this, is to try and get an interactive discussion going so that we can understand from the market where you see these technologies going. Obviously, encryption is not like it was 20 years ago. It was a bit of an elephant, and trying to chew at that was, nobody really knew where to start. It's come a long way since then. It's not overhead intensive. And obviously, regulations are pushing us more and more to look at protecting your crown jewels. Not everything has to be encrypted, obviously, but we need to protect the crown jewels. And it really doesn't, it's not only financial services, it's all industries that are governed by the regulations, PPA, HIPAA, etc., etc. So the objective of this session is really to have an interactive discussion, and I hope that that's how we proceed.
Thanks, Karen. I hope so too. So my voice might come across as hopefully many of the attendees, but let's hope it's not all my questions. Thank you so much for the introduction. Neil, if you want, I'm going to hand over to you just to firstly say welcome, and if you can tell us a little bit around what you've seen happening in the encryption area from a TELUS perspective.
Cool. Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Neil Costa, Regional Sales Director for TELUS CPL Business Unit, focusing on the data security side of things. I've been in this role with 3 different companies for the last 10 years through acquisitions. Same technologies, just different brands. So SafeNet became Gemalto, which became TELUS, but I've been doing this for 10 years and in the IT security space for about 15 years before that. So I'm quite comfortable showing my age there. Just in terms of encryption and where this conversation needs to be going, yes, I work for TELUS, but this conversation is not about the technology that we provide. This is more to understand what's happening in the market and where the encryption conversation is going. When I started in this role 10 years ago, encryption was incredibly challenging to discuss, to engage with people about, because of the perceived complexity of what encryption is, the impact that it has on business in terms of performance, and how complex the solutions were to implement and manage. We have evolved significantly since then, driven largely by compliance mandates, but also by the impact of data security on business, how data is being stolen and manipulated by environments. Encryption, because of that, has become relatively mainstream. If you consider every database vendor now has encryption as a standard part of the solution. Most commercial off-the-shelf applications that store data of any type do have an option to encrypt that data in its own right. So as business, if you look into your organizations, there is actually an immense amount of encryption within the organization. And where encryption finds itself today is where IT found itself 25 years ago, that it was very unmanaged and had grown organically as opposed to strategically within the business. So the conversation is really around where is encryption today in your organization? What are the challenges that you're facing, and how are people addressing those challenges currently in the market and going to be addressing those challenges in the future? Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you, Neil. I really appreciate that intro. I think that gives us a great bit of insight. I think you've really touched on quite a few areas that I think would be really valuable to talk around. And in my experience in the industry and around this topic, I'm probably quite one of the people that need to be caught up along the technology to understand a little bit more about where it's got to and how businesses are managing it. So let me start off with some of my questions, but I will prompt once again to the audience that please line up the questions in the Q&A, and we'll bring them forward to Neil and Karen. But otherwise, I will begin, and I'll try and start with some of the more simple questions, also for my own benefit, to gain some understanding on the topic, but to try and set the tone wherever possible. So my first question for Neil or Karen. I think there are so many security requirements and tools that organizations are faced with from an everyday perspective. And encryption is certainly one of the more mature tools around, but I think it's often possibly misunderstood and left alone. How much has changed in this encryption space, and why is encryption still so important for an organization?
So Brendan, if I can ask the question in a rather perverse manner. If anybody has been hit by a ransomware attack and your data has been encrypted by a hacker, you know how powerful encryption is. What the industry is trying to achieve is using encryption for good, not for bad. And the ability to encrypt your data allows you to protect it from prying eyes. The evolution of that has been very interesting, because when it started out, even 10 years ago, encryption was a really technical solution to implement, where the integration required some strong technical coding, some strong integration solutions and solution engineers to make the product work and the encryption work in the environment. I had many CISOs and CIOs saying to me, Neil, encryption is not an enterprise solution. It's just too complex. It's too challenging. And the technology has evolved to the point that encryption happens behind the scene. The term now is largely TDE, transparent data encryption, because to the users, it is transparent. An authorized user doesn't even know that the data is encrypted. Unauthorized users, unauthorized access to data is prevented because the data is encrypted. But if you're authorized, you don't want to know the data is encrypted. You don't want to see a performance impact. You don't want to see a requirement to apply a key. You don't want to have to install or run an application to decrypt the data. You want it to be totally transparent for the user as a consumer, a legitimate consumer of the data. So this whole migration has been to make encryption a relatively blunt instrument behind the scenes to protect the data from unauthorized access. And the evolution has allowed that to happen quite comfortably in business. So that's a lot of what we're seeing. Where the challenge has migrated to, particularly with every commercial off-the-shelf application offering encryption to a degree, is the centralized management of the keys. And what happens if somebody loses their keys? What happens if those keys are not accessible? What happens if the person who owns the keys gets hit by a bus, or whatever the case may be? So centralized key management has become the next challenge to overcome. As encryptions become simpler, the key management has become more complex.
I think that's spot on, and that's probably one of the things that scares me about the topic is those keys. I'm always losing my keys, but mostly my car keys. So on that part of the topic, what tools are there, or what tools have you seen that organizations are using to manage their keys, or is that just not something that's really happening?
I don't know, Karen, maybe you want to jump in after. I don't want to hog the mic all the time, but Brendan, if you lose your car keys, your only solution is to go and find your spare. And the reality is your spare key is in a place that you know where it is. With the key management that has been evolving, it's about keeping those keys centrally, about a team being responsible for the keys and the management of those keys in the centralized environment, for the generation of those keys, for the rotation of those keys, the destruction of those keys, whatever the policy says that you need to do with those keys, allowing the segregation of duties, the key custodians to be able to own the keys and control the keys, separate from the application owners or data consumers. That way you have them centralized. They're not likely to be lost, and they're not being distributed everywhere. Your challenge is a redundancy challenge more than anything else, that if the system goes down and you can't access the keys, you can't decrypt the data. So you need to be mature enough as a business to have a redundant environment for business continuity. Karen, if you want to add to that.
Yes, just in terms of segregation of duties, policies, etc., those policies need to be clearly defined to avoid being in a situation where you cannot back up your keys. So invariably, well, it depends on the maturity of the organization in terms of their policies around key management. But this is also where technology can assist. As trusted advisors, we assist through that process. So outside of that, I don't have anything else to add, Neil.
We've actually got some questions popping up in the chat, so I think it's a great opportunity to introduce some of those, and they look similar to questions that I've got as well. And I think this is quite important because, Neil, you touched on a lot of the platforms earlier that have different. They've all got their own encryption technologies, and Karen, you spoke about the crown jewels of the organization. So one of the attendees has asked, how do I know what data in my organization needs to be encrypted? And I think that for me is probably one of the biggest questions, because if we don't necessarily, I'm sure, want to have to protect everything. So how do we understand that?
Are we going to start with the first question?
Sorry, the question is, how do I know what data in my organization needs to be encrypted? I just added a bit on, I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, that's where data classification comes in. Ultimately, it's not all data that needs to be encrypted. That would be really flogging a dead horse. You need to identify the sensitive data that is important to you as an organization, and specifically focus on encrypting that data. The benefit of the technologies that are available is obviously that you can encrypt at a file, a database, a folder level. It's not I've got to do data encryption, so I've got to encrypt everything. No, it's not like that at all. You identify the sensitive data, and I do understand that in organizations, there tends to be silos. Everybody's doing their own thing. Every opco has got their own set of policies, but it should be a overarching problem to address from the organization's perspective.
Okay, fantastic. So we need to understand what the data is and to classify it.
Okay, so if I can add to that, from a data perspective, understanding what you need to classify comes down to understanding the value of the data or data set. Compliance mandates will tell you certain things that you have to protect. So if you're in the financial services industry and you're dealing with cardholder data, PCI DSS will say cardholder data. It will define what that data is, and it will tell you what needs to be protected and how it needs to be protected. If you take protection of personal information legislations, in South Africa it's POPI, but they exist all around the world in each country. Those protection of personal information mandates will tell you what personal information is and the fact that you need to protect it. So being able to identify from compliance mandates is important. So that is an industry guidance on the type of data to be protected. As an organization, you will look at your business and say, what is the data that my business deems to be valuable in terms of how we operate and what we need to protect? What gives us our competitive advantage? What is essential for us as a business to protect? There's a story that I tell quite regularly about and I'll use inverted commas here, but I don't know if you can see them on the screen, a gentleman's magazine who decided that they were going to make use of this new thing called the internet. This was in the late 90s. They were going to be offering some graphical content to subscribers that would be prepared to pay a monthly subscription to this. And at the time, they had a very robust security and compliance infrastructure in place. They had multi-factor authentication, so users logged in, username, password, multi-factor authentication. The system went back to look at the billing system to make sure that that subscriber had paid their monthly subscription and that they were eligible to access the content that this company was providing. Within 6 months of going live, they were compromised. With respect, the hackers didn't think that the graphical content was necessarily worth that much money. They stole the subscriber database and were able to blackmail some high-profile individuals into their internet browsing habits, and they got credit card information which allowed them to purchase or use these credit cards fraudulently. The bottom line then was the organization didn't know that that data needed to be protected because it was valuable. In this day and age, we're a lot more mature. The compliance mandates tell us a lot of that data which needs to be protected, but as business, we also have an understanding on the value of data, that many businesses are built on the value of their data alone. So we understand that we need to protect that data, and we need to protect as much of it as makes sense to protect. To support what Karen says, you don't need to encrypt every single solitary little bit of data in your organization unless it's critical data to your organization. And it's about, how do you protect that? What do you protect it against? What risk are you mitigating? So understanding what that data is and how to protect it is one step. The next challenge that you face is, where is that data? Because data migrates a lot, and that comes down to discovering that data inside your organization. Sorry, I expanded a little bit on the answer, but I think that's quite a comprehensive response.
I think so. And my takeaway from that is that there's probably two areas you need to focus on. One is what is your compliance requirements? That's going to tell you exactly what data to go look for. And the other is understand what data is valuable to your business and protect that. And yeah, you're going to have to look around probably across multiple systems and understand where that data might exist, because it does migrate. That's fantastic. I think that's a really concise answer. Thank you. Or comprehensive, let me say. So yeah, lots of questions coming through, which is great. Thank you very much. Another one we've got, let me just see this, that might take us slightly off the topic. I'm going to just try and stay on the topic of understanding the data quickly and bring this other question in here. So one of the attendees has asked, how do we handle encryption for data at rest versus data in transit? And are there specific considerations or technologies that they should be using?
Okay, so I think I'll take that answer, response, if I may, Brendan. So data at rest is relatively simple to control, because it's not going anywhere, it's not being used. So the encryption of that data at rest is quite simple. The challenge that you have to consider there is, who has access to that data and when do they need access? So policy allows you to do that. Data in motion is typically the data that is flowing through your network. And again, relatively simple technologies to solve that, some free, some with cost, depending on your business requirement and the impact that you can allow on the performance of that. But essentially, that's the ability to encrypt your network or data that flows across your network. That the network encryption is a blunt instrument, because essentially you encrypt on one side, decrypt on the other, and where the data flows, it's protected. So different technologies should be part of your same encryption framework, encryption strategy, and essentially you would like the keys centrally managed or centrally stored, at least, so that they are under the control of the enterprise and not distributed or subject to compromise. Because if the keys are compromised, everything is compromised. So different technologies, but should be part of the same strategy.
Okay, and then hopefully management comes in a more unified way, where I think that's probably quite important. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Neil. So I think the next one does change the topic slightly, but I think it's a topic that I had some questions about as well. And I think it's definitely a good one to answer. So one of the attendees has asked, are there concerns that quantum computers will eventually be able to break encryption? And I had a very similar question, with the event and the addition of ChatGPT and all these technologies, AI technologies coming at us, but really quantum computing, some of the encryption standards, I'm sure, would be relatively easy for computers of that power to decrypt.
Okay, so the bottom line is, quantum computing will be able to break your encryption. The end. That is an undeniable fact. The challenge that we face is, if you don't update and upgrade your environments, have key rotation, then you do run that risk. So if the data stays in your control, you have the ability to apply quantum resistant encryption technologies, double key encryption, and a number of other strategies that will allow you to protect that data more robustly. I did notice that Kirsten had a follow-up question in the chat about what if somebody takes your data offline, they will have the ability to, at their own leisure, decrypt that data. And that is 100% correct. When somebody takes your data offline, they will be able to decrypt that. So what we're looking at here is defense in depth. You don't want people to be able to exfiltrate your data in the first place. Encryption, like any other technology, is the solution to some of the problem and some of the solution to all of the problem, but it's not all of the solution to all of the problem. The phrase that people use is a silver bullet. I do like that phrase. If you're being come at by a werewolf, a silver bullet is great, but it doesn't help you in the zombie apocalypse. So you need different technologies to protect you against different threats. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I mean, we all know, many of us living in sunny South Africa, the crime capital of the world, we all understand that your physical security around your house, you live in a boomed area, then you've got a high wall, then you've got electric fencing, then you've got beams, then you've got an alarm, you've got dogs. So that is defense in depth in the physical realm. When you move into the digital realm, same applies. Yes, you've still got firewalls, you've still got IPSs. Encryption is one of the tools, and managing those keys is important, but it has to be a complete security strategy. It's not as Neil said, a silver bullet. Unfortunately, there are very motivated individuals that are paid to hack into organizations' networks. And if they don't hack into them, they don't get paid. So we've got to, as security specialists, consistently try and keep ahead of that curve. That's what I wanted to add.
I agree with that. I think it's South Africans are probably the most prepared to defend themselves from a security perspective. So if you can translate that into your technology strategy, I think South Africa could probably bring the foremost security specialists out in the world. Thanks very much. I think that really does answer the question. Quantum computing is absolutely a threat, but I'm sure that the advent of quantum computing, or the introduction of quantum computing into security as well, will also assist in maturing the security around and teaching us the lessons that need to be learned to strengthen these encryption methods. Great. So I think we've answered those. Thanks very much. We've got a couple more here. Jerome has asked two questions. And firstly, he's asked, and I'm not too sure exactly how to frame this, but he's asked, do you think that encryption is the main key for a company's success? And I'm assuming that's around a company's successful security strategy or success in protecting their business. So yeah, I think either of you could answer that. I think we have touched on it quite a bit. I don't know. It is a silver bullet. It's not an arsenal of weapons, but it's certainly one of the protection mechanisms, at least in Neil's analogy, that needs to be in place to protect critical and compliance data. I don't know if there's any more that we can add to that.
So Brendan, just quickly to add to that, if the encryption is deployed in a strategic way, it can be a mechanism of securely enabling your business. And in that regard, it would be able to allow a business to be successful or securely successful. Encryption is not going to lead to the success or destruction of a business unless you're compromised and you haven't been encrypting your data, especially if you've got a compliance mandate that says you have to. So yeah, I don't really see it as specifically making a company successful or not, but if properly deployed, it can make sure that your security is securely enabling your business.
And I think the adverse of that, Neil, is if we're not considering these security strategies, that potentially it could result in, could a business suffer the loss of that data, and would that in turn make it unsuccessful? And I think so. Jerome had a follow-up question on that, and he's asked what the consequences would be if a company's data is not encrypted. And I think, for me, those are quite, from a compliance perspective, if the data is leaked and it's not encrypted, I think there's a fair, the companies will be held accountable, certainly by each of their regulators that they might have to answer to. But maybe you've got some more insight as to what the consequences could be.
So yeah, there's a sales technique called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations use FUD to scare people into buying their technology. So at the risk of FUD, there are consequences of not securing your data, whether through encryption or any other mechanism. And that would be a fine or a penalty from a regulator. That would be your data being held to ransom by a ransomware attacker. That could be the loss of customers or the lack of an uptake of a service that you're trying to take to market because people don't trust your business. So there are definitely consequences to not securing your data, and encryption is a mechanism of securing your data.
Spot on, absolutely. Thank you. Great, thanks, Jerome, for the questions. Kirsten had another follow-up question. She's asking the really tough ones. Kirsten has asked,
you should be one of the speakers.
Kirsten should.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Or maybe she can answer this question for us if she wants to come on. So she's asked, she'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and it can't be my thoughts because I don't have any on this particular one, on lattice-based encryption.
Well, lattice-based encryption is still in infancy stages. I mean, it is aimed at post-quantum cryptography. That's about all I can say on it right now. Neil, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to add to that, it is one of the mechanisms that people are using to look at resolving the threat of post-quantum computing and the additional processing power that brings. So lattice-based cryptography is a more comprehensive type of cryptography, double key encryption, some of the elliptic curve algorithms that are out there. There are a number of mechanisms that are being looked at, lattice-based cryptography being one of them, to address the post-quantum computing risk. The reality, I believe, is that we are going to end up seeing a combination of a number of technologies to address post-quantum computing. And this may or may not be one of them, depending on how people embrace it, whether it is standards-based, whether it is the extent it has on performance impact and business, etc., etc. There's lots of considerations as to whether this is part of the solution or if it falls by the wayside. Time will tell.
And I think Moore's law means that time's going to speed up as far as quantum computing goes and is involved in our lives. So we had another interesting question here from Bonga, and it's quite a long one. I don't know if you've had a chance to view it, but ultimately, I think what Bonga is trying to ask here is that he had an experience with had some web scraping had been engaged, and he realized that it's probably something that could be quite dangerous. And he's asking, if the data is presented to an end user and not encrypted and it's highly sensitive, how does one protect that data? And I think that's probably...
But Brendan, I think that is probably the most difficult one to tackle. And the prime example of that is email, because people send a lot of information via email, and there are ways of solving it, but unfortunately not clean. Because if I have an encrypted email that I send to you, if you decrypt that, I have no mechanism to enforce that you now protect that data going forward. And it's the same when you present highly sensitive data to a third party in a decrypted manner. Your ability to control what they do with that is a lot more difficult to manage. What we need to do with our customers, and this is where the consultation that Karen was talking about in the beginning comes in, to say, how do we allow you to present this data in a way that minimizes your risk? How do we secure that data? If you have to present this information out in the wild, then the sensitivity of it may be that you don't want it changed. So digitally signing the data or the document might be enough of a solution to that problem. But each solution will be unique to that use case and what the particular person needs to address. So very happy to sit down in a one-on-one, talk about your specific challenge that you're facing and how cryptography can or cannot address that, because cryptography doesn't address everything. There are other technologies that may need to be deployed to solve particular problems.
Thanks, Neil. I think that does sum it up. This particular example was on web scraping and being able to get personally identifiable information out of a website. And I think the other side of that is that we all need to take a suspicious approach to presenting our data and making sure and thinking, how could this data potentially be compromised or potentially be breached or taken or stolen, and apply technologies around that. And encryption is not always going to be the technology, absolutely, but we need to be using that as part of our arsenal, I believe, and certainly being more suspicious all the time about what, and thinking from a compliance point of view as well. You know, what is the impact of me putting this data where it is, and is it secure? Thanks, Bongo, for that. So we had another question from Michael. How is the data encryption performed between data on premise and on cloud? And I think that's a question I had as well. You know, with a lot of organizations having multi-cloud strategies and still having some on-prem technology that's linked into the environments. How do we manage encryption across all of these environments? And he's particularly asked using vendor tools. And can that be done?
Being a slightly more technology-driven question, what you're really wanting to achieve is encrypting that data wherever it is, whether it's in the cloud, on-prem. It may not be encrypted using the same technology. It may be encrypted if it's in the cloud with a cloud vendor's technology. If it's on-prem with a encryption-specific technology or a commercial off-the-shelf already encrypted environment, encrypting that data wherever that data happens to be is the first part of the strategy of deploying encryption across the entire organization. Centrally managing those keys, as I said in the beginning, becomes the challenge that you need to address. Being able to bring all of those keys under the control of the organization. Encrypted data is of no value to anybody. The ability to decrypt it becomes the valuable part. So bringing all of those keys into a centralized environment under the control of the organization. And this also speaks to a further question down the line from Irfan about outsource or not outsource your encryption. If you're outsourcing your encryption, even outsourcing the process of the encryption is not necessarily a problem with certain data environments. It's about being able to maintain control of the keys. And a lot of your compliance mandates do say you need to be able to maintain control and prove that you control the keys. This is what technology is able to do today, is that centralized key management of your keys, regardless of where the encryption is taking place.
Thanks, Neil. And I think that actually answers the next question as well, which is around shadow IT. And an anecdote that I can share is that organizations also need to understand what their what they're being held accountable for in even the papaya legislation. There are certain individuals in an organization that will be held accountable by law should data be leaked. And so shadow IT, I think, is something that every organization is facing in some way or another. And it is a very hard thing to control. I don't think there's not a tool that we can click next and load a wizard to control shadow IT. But I do think that it is an organization-wide challenge. But it's obviously up to each organization to see how they manage that. But it is definitely something I think that needs to be of concern when thinking about data and compliance. Okay, so I think
sure. If I can add to that, you've got the shadow IT where people have installed solutions that IT does not necessarily know about. You've also got data creep, where data is creeping, where users create a new folder, a new server comes up, and data creeps all over the place. From an encryption perspective, what encryption or the technologies today are able to do is, in the start of the process, is a data discovery and classification component where you can scan the organization and go and discover the data. And when you start discovering databases with POPI data in it, or PCI data, or whatever data subset you're looking for in that, it gives you an insight into what solutions are out there, helping you identify those shadow IT creeps that have happened in your business. So that is a mechanism that encryption can help you protect that data going forward. It's not going to stop shadow IT by any manner of means. It's not a solution to shadow IT, but it is there are tools in place that will help you identify where shadow IT has taken place.
Absolutely. And I think probably also help you prevent your data appearing in those shadow IT environments if it's not, if it shouldn't be allowed. Ifran, I think we've answered your question, and Neil did cover this, if you should outsource your encryption or own it yourself. And I do think Neil touched on that, as well as then who the custodian of the key needs to be, which I think is, it's just two parts on the same question, really. I don't know, Karen, if you've got some insight as to the compliance question that we have here from one of the attendees. And they say, we are currently in compliance with specific data protection regulations or standards that require encryption, such as GDPR and HIPAA. If so, how do encryption practices align with the requirements outlined by these regulations? And what measures do we have to place to ensure ongoing compliance? And I think there's a lot of questions in there, but I think that's quite a good one.
Where to start? Hang on, let me just find the first part of the question.
So the first part of the question is can encryption be used to achieve these compliance standards?
Oh, no, 100%. It's certainly a tool to be used in your journey to become compliant to the relevant regulations. We've mentioned before, it's not the silver bullet, it's not the only thing you need to worry about, but it is certainly, if you look at the regulations, all of these regulations, the foundation of them is protecting that sensitive information. If you start with encrypting that, you manage your keys properly. It does tick a lot of the boxes for all of these regulatory requirements.
Absolutely. Okay, so it's definitely going to assist in that journey, and I think will be part of what the regulations actually ask for. Fantastic. Thanks, Karen. Okay, great. We have a whole stream of questions. Sorry, Neil.
I was just going to add that the compliance mandates, they talk specifically about GDPR and HIPAA. The compliance mandates mature a lot, but there is a significant overlap between the controls that each different compliance mandate stipulates that one should be using. So they all make reference to authentication. They all make reference to encryption. They all make reference to key management. Some of them make reference to keys in hardware, but there is a lot of overlap between the technologies that are being recommended or enforced within a compliance mandate. And as I say, there's a massive overlap between that. For an organization that is going through having to address a number of different compliance mandates, your best bet is to sit internally with your auditors, your risk and compliance team, and the compliance mandates, and map them to each other. A lot of those mappings are already done on the internet. You can find them. But to go in and map those compliance mandates and say, okay, this is where they overlap, and these are the areas that outlie. How do we make sure we address all of our compliance mandates without duplicating our work and effort?
Fantastic. I agree with that. Thanks so much, Neil and Karen. So we've got a few questions from Gugu here, and all very relevant to the conversation. So let's start with the first one here. Gugu's asked, what is your opinion on the current state of computer security? And I actually had some addition to that in a question that I had lined up to ask you. And it was also to say, how ready are organizations around encryption, and how mature is it? And I think it's kind of the same question.
I think a lot of industries have always just assumed that encryption, these types of security measures are only for financial services organizations, and it's not. Like I said earlier, every single industry has regulations to comply to, and compliance is becoming a major issue. All of a sudden now you've got compliance officers, and every business builds their systems and then thinks about compliance afterwards. So there's lots of questions from Gugu.
Yeah, there is, but I agree with that. I think that compliance is often thought about afterwards, but it probably needs to be thought about right at the beginning. But in the same way, I think the compliance teams also need, technologists need to become more compliant, and compliance teams need to become a little bit more of technologists as well, to understand how these technologies can all help them. So the next question, I have no idea. So it's definitely up for the two of you. What is the best way to prevent replay attacks?
Brendan, I think that I'll probably ask to Gugu if we can take that offline. A replay attack, I'm not 100% sure if crypto even has a role to play in the prevention of a replay attack. And based on the previous question, kind of what is the general state of computer security, I think that there's a lot more conversation to be had in that space outside of this crypto time. I'm aware that we are running close to the end of our hour that's been allocated for this, but as security's evolved and technology has been introduced to mitigate threats, people have implemented some, not all technology. People have some budget, but not enough budget. The only company that I ever heard of who at one stage was saying that they had unlimited budget was Saudi Aramco. Even they've changed that. Even they now have budgets that they need to comply with. So we can't spend enough money to mitigate all the risks. There aren't enough skills around to mitigate all the risks. But there are intelligent ways of deploying technology and addressing company or organization specific risks to get the most bang for your buck. So I think, Gugu, if you open to that, I think let's see if we can have an offline conversation and dig into what you actually trying to address and what your concerns are. I can go through how crypto works and other types of solutions that we can solve. It'll probably be easier in a one-on-one conversation.
Thanks,
Just to answer that, Gugu, at the end of the day, a replay attack is a network type of attack. The whole idea is the data that the man in the middle, the malicious hacker, is trying to steal, what is the worth of that data to your organization? So in terms of cryptography and how that assists, is obviously making sure that if they do get that data, there's nothing that they can do with it.
Thanks so much, Karen. Actually, if you don't mind, we've only got a few minutes to go, and I think jumping to Ryan Kloppers' question would be quite insightful for me. And Ryan has asked how we find ways to get to markets that are smaller. So this typically is, in Ryan's opinion, is used in corporate companies and financial institutions from a technology perspective. And when it comes to small to medium-sized businesses, it's not easy for them to get into these sort of technologies due to the costs. And how do we find ways to get into these markets that are more cost effective? So I would love to hear from both of you if there are cost effective versions of this technology that can be used across all the different business sizes.
Like I said earlier, the encryption does not have to be a big bang approach. Our suggestion is find a business case within the organization where you have sensitive data. You want to make sure that that data, being your crown jewels, is protected, and start with that, and you can build on it. It's not a one big bang approach. It's very modular. Can start at file, database level, folder level. It's irrelevant.
Fantastic, thank you.
And then, if I can add to that, there is cost, and obviously one needs to consider what is the cost of the solution, but then there's also worth. And what is it worth to the business to have or not to have a solution that mitigates a particular risk? It's about the cost versus the worth of the solution that a business needs to go back and say, how do I address that? The technologies have got more cost effective, as Karen says. They are building blocks. You don't go out and spend $1 million on a solution to encrypt the world. You address what you require, and there are mechanisms to make sure that it is worth what the problem that it's solving. So happy to understand what the exact requirement is and how we can address.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that's important. Just find the point to start, find the data that's most valuable to your organization. That's what you need to focus on. And it doesn't have to be scary. And like they say in that analogy, the only way to eat an elephant is to start with one bite at a time. So and often these are really big projects and rather large considerations for an organization. So I agree with that. Let's just start with a very specific focus. Okay, we've really got 3 or 4 minutes left, so let's just quickly see. Gugu had some more questions here, and we can try and run through them very quickly. Gugu's asked, what is the role played by authentication in cryptography?
Authentication is just another layer as a use case. A bank might, with large transactions in their corporate environment, for their business users, they might give them a digital certificate loaded on a USB key. So obviously you've got multi-factors of authentication, but then the back end in terms of actually managing those keys and the movement of those keys is where the encryption comes in. So it's really, your encryption forms the foundation of the other levels, which authentication would be another level.
Fantastic. Maybe we can then just pivot into Gugu's other question, which was about if you could briefly explain how the different types of keys work together to encrypt and decrypt the data.
That's a relatively technical conversation. I do have a little presentation that I give on that about synchronous and asynchronous. But in some instances, in synchronous encryption, you have the same key that encrypts and decrypts. The formula is a little bit smaller. The keys lengths need to be a little bit longer because it tends to be a little bit easier to break. But it has a less performance impact. Asynchronous encryption, you use one key to encrypt and a different key to decrypt, which is the premise of PKI, public key infrastructure, where you've got a public key and a private key. You encrypt with your public key, you decrypt with your private key, so that somebody can encrypt and decrypt for you. So again, different technologies, different types of keys. It's probably a 10 or 15 minute technical explanation to go through how encryption actually works and the different keys and key types.
Okay, so maybe we can spin off into that directly with Gugu, but thank you very much. The next question from Michael, I think, is a little bit too long for us to answer in the last 30 seconds of the call. So we have reached the end of the time. I think the conversation was fantastic. Thank you. We had a lot of really great questions here, and I hope that this has added some value to all the attendees. From myself and at Tech Central, we'd just like to thank you. And I know from Altron and Systems Integration and Talis, we'd like to also thank you. So there will be an online recording version of this webinar that you'll be able to view on the Tech Central website going forward, and there'll also be a written up article about it. And please, reach out to anyone for any additional information that's on the call, and I'm sure the team will be in touch with you as well. Any closing comments from yourselves, Neil and Karen?
I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for your participation. Without hearing from you as the crowd, obviously these sessions are not as effective. So thank you.
And from my side, also thank you to everybody for joining the call. An hour of your valuable time is much appreciated. Please take what you've heard today, mull over it, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'll assist where we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.